fourth module here of State Legislators Development and Diversity. We're going to take a look at the final couple of things related to state legislatures. The biggest thing really is this idea of the types of legislatures that we have. And this is where the real amount of diversity comes in. So we have professional, hybrid, and citizen legislators. So the number of professional states is 11 states, number of citizen legislatures is 17, the number of hybrid 22. And the time on the job basically is for a professional legislature about 80% of the year, 70% of the year for hybrid, or the 80% of their time, and then about half of citizen legislators spends their time on their job here. You can see there's a substantial amount of difference between the compensations here between a professional and citizen legislature. Obviously, one of the goals of a professional legislator is to stay in office. $69,000 isn't exactly a lot, but it's definitely better than the median income in the United States, and definitely better a lot than the roughly $16,000 for a citizen legislator. You can also see that there's a big difference in the amount of staff per member between a professional legislature and a citizen legislature, ranging from almost 9 staff per member for professionalized state legislators down to a little bit more than 1 for a citizen legislature, in some cases none, all right? So in looking at this, I think one of the interesting things is I did a survey a number of years ago asking state legislators around the country to do some things. And one of the states that we surveyed was the state of West Virginia, which has Virginia we did, and that has a citizen legislator which only meets about 60 or so days a year. You would think that you just wouldn't respond to a letter from an academic, but apparently this guy had something in for our study and basically wrote back to us and said, I'm a citizen legislator, I have another job, I'm trying to do my job here, I don't have time to fill out these forms, which frankly, if he would have just spent the same amount of time filling out the form, he probably could have completed it in the same amount of time. But that's kind of the mentality, right? They're not there full time. They are there part-time, and they have other jobs to do. Here is get out your magnifying glasses here. I like this chart because it basically shows you the amount of time that the 50 state legislators around the country spend in office. And this is 2014, so you see a number of these states that there, say for example Texas, that there is no time in office, because remember we talked a little bit about the fact that some legislators only meet once every 2 years. But you can see that there's a broad differentiation here between those states that are considered to be professionalized state legislatures and those that are citizens. So you can see the big lines here, the California, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, which pretty much meet year-round. And then you see these other states, like for example, take a look at New Mexico, which basically meets for about 30 days a year. If you take a look at Virginia, again, they're a state that doesn't meet for much more than about a month. A bunch of these other citizen state legislatures. So big differentiation in the amount of time depending on professional versus citizen legislatures. Now, Alan Rosenthal created a couple of typologies here. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it does give you kind of a little bit of an understanding of how we would categorize different state legislators. So if we take a look at the left-hand side, basically is the idea of the amount of staff that you have and the amount of time that you're going to spend in the state legislature. So if you've got a pretty heavy schedule, right? Go back up here, take a look at Pennsylvania, California, Massachusetts, Michigan, and you've got a larger staff. And again, go back up here, we see staff, 8.9 staff per member for professionalized, 1.2 for citizen. What you see is that heavy schedule, large staff, you're considered to be a full-on professional legislature, right? In some of those states, you have a heavy schedule, and these are kind of the hybrids. You have a heavy schedule, you meet a fair amount of the year, but you don't have very much staff. What Rosenthal would categorize those states as being is work-intensive legislature. In other words, you've got a lot of stuff to do, and you're basically doing it on your own because you don't have a lot of staff. In some cases, you might have a larger staff, but you don't meet very often. And that would be a categorization that Rosenthal calls the support-intensive legislature. And then finally, those work-intensive and support-intensive legislatures, probably more hybrids. And then you've got the poor amateurs there who have, very small staff and a very light schedule. That's the amateur legislature. Now, on the other side, we see the second kind of part of his typology, which is how much time you spend in your office and how long you've been there. So professional legislators basically serve full-time and a long time, right? In other words, they're there for a career. Citizens legislators are part-timers in the amount of time that they spend as legislators, and they generally don't serve very long. And once I show you a couple of the salaries from these kind of citizen legislators, you'll understand exactly why that might be the case. And in some cases, you might have to be in a full-time job as a state legislator, but you don't stay very long. And that's what he calls citizens on leave legislators. And sometimes some people in the kind of citizen legislators serve for a long time, and it's really a consequence of the type of job that they have, which we'll see in a couple of minutes. All right. So here we've got an example of a professional legislature, which is Pennsylvania, and a citizen legislature, which is New Hampshire. Right. The quintessential citizen legislature is the state of New Hampshire. And the question here for these two states and for members of the legislature is, what do they consider themselves to be as far as occupation is considered, right? And if you take a look at Pennsylvania, more than 3/4 of the state legislators in Pennsylvania consider themselves to be a full-time legislator. That is their job. That's what I do for a living, right? And then there's a few other people, attorneys, whatever. But everything else on there, after you get below attorney, is 2% or lower. Like one out of the entire kind of state legislator. Now take a look at the New Hampshire occupations, and the amount of people that consider themselves in New Hampshire as a citizen legislator to be a full-time legislator. You have to drill the whole way down there to the fourth to the bottom, and 0.5%, 1/2 of 1% of members of the New Hampshire legislature consider themselves to be a full-time legislator. Almost half of the people there are retired, right? They have the time to be able to do this. They probably already accomplished their financial goals. It's not a problem. And other people are in flexible positions, right? Think about this. If you're not getting paid a lot and you have to do a job, you have to have flexibility. So consultants, business owners, real estate agents, attorneys, homemakers, so forth. Educators, I'm not quite sure how that all works out because they meet right during the school year. They must get leave. One of the things that we talk about for this increased capacity is the S of staff. And so you have individual member staff, right? And on top of that, committee staff, which help draw up various pieces of legislation. And then in addition to that, a number of states, particularly the more professionalized state legislatures, have legislative research councils, which are nonpartisan bodies which help people draw up legislation and go through kind of those best practices that we talked about earlier. So in Pennsylvania, the Legislative Reference Bureau is led by an adjunct professor at Widener Commonwealth Law School. And he essentially, and his staff of lawyers, help individual members of the state legislature take an idea that they have and then draw it up into a piece of legislation. So you may have an idea, but you're not quite sure, well, what law does this change that's already in force, what part of the code? And the LRB basically will go back and help work with the state legislator to help them draft up the language that is necessary to have a constitutional piece of state legislation. And that's available to everyone. It's kind of a confidential service, and that's the way it works. In Pennsylvania, we'll click through here, we also have a number of other things that we call legislative service agencies, which are available to help legislators on topics that are of importance to them. So if we drill down to the bottom of pages for the Pennsylvania Legislature, you can see offices and info here. So there are things like the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, the Independent Fiscal Office, Joint State Government Commission, Legislative Budget and Finance Committee, and so on. They're basically local government commission that are tasked with basically doing studies for members of the state legislature. And their goal is to provide, objective overviews of problems that are facing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And in some cases, they will provide recommendations. In other cases, they are by law not allowed to do so. So, for example, the Independent Fiscal Office studies the incoming revenues, the outgoing revenues, and will say how something, like say we decide to lower the sales tax or increase the sales tax and get rid of the property tax, what effect will that have on the budget? They will produce those numbers, but not tell the state legislature, we think you ought to do this or we think you shouldn't. They just provide the information. Others will make recommendations. So those are important agencies and do very high quality research for members of the state legislature. And that occurs in most state legislatures. I just kind of gave you the input of what happens here in Pennsylvania. When we take a look at legislative staff, what you see is that there has been an increase overall in the amount of staff in the United States over the last several decades. I wish this went back a little bit farther, but it doesn't. But what you'll also see is that in recent years, particularly post-recession, Great Recession, we've seen kind of a tailing off of that growth and actually a pairing off of some of these staffs around the country. So the general numbers on the long-term secular trend is up, but there has been a little bit of an arc in recent years in which they paired off a number of employees. But again, over the long term, there has been a substantial increase in the amount of staff in legislatures around the country. Another thing that we take a look at when it comes to capacity is the idea of states with term limits. One of the things is that while there has been the amount of increase in state legislative professionalism in a lot of states, a number of states, particularly starting in the 1990s, there's a big backlash against state legislatures. We try to do, some people try to do this at the congressional level to limit term limits there, but you need a constitutional amendment to do that. The threshold is very high. But a bunch of states passed term limits, particularly those states that have direct democracy, where the people can put an issue on the ballot, not the politicians. Because again, as with anything here, as rational, self-interested actors, we would expect that politicians wouldn't naturally want to put themselves out of the job. So most of the states that have term limits, actually, this was done by the people through the direct democracy process and not by the state legislature itself. So you see here the states with term limits. The kind of, I guess if you had to say, the typical term limit would be 8 years for the House and 8 years for the Senate. In some cases, they're consecutive years, so I could serve 8 years in the House and maybe flip over and go to the Senate for 8 years and then go back to the House, or maybe run for mayor and then come back to the state legislature. In some cases, there's a lifetime ban. Once you've gone through this amount of years, that's it, you're done, and you're out of there. So that's the case as well. The idea for term limits really, like I said, reached its kind of peak in the 1990s and haven't really heard much about it since then. One thing that we can talk about also is legislative salary. So not surprisingly, you would expect that in those states that have a professionalized state legislature, you'd be more likely to make more money. So if you are in California, which is the highest paid state in the country, they get paid $100,000. This is the typical member. If you happen to be in a leadership position, you get additional money on top of this. But the typical member makes $100,000 a year, and while they're in session, you get $176 per day per diem. In other words, to help out with the cost of maybe staying in Sacramento, eating, so forth. Pennsylvania, the typical salary for the run-of-the-mill kind of member of the state legislature is $85,000. And we get 170. I'm not a member of the state legislature. Our representatives get $175 per day per diem, right? Now, take a look at that in relationship to New Hampshire, right? New Hampshire is the lowest paid, non-professional, most typical citizen legislature in the country. You get $200 every 2 years and no per diem, right? So, if you are in the legislative session, you have to pay for your own travel, your own food, staying overnight if you have to at the state capitol. All that money comes out of pocket, right? So it's understandable why people wouldn't make careers in the New Hampshire state legislature. You're not going to get rich off of that. You certainly don't get a pension like you would in Pennsylvania. If you take a look here in Pennsylvania at the bottom here, this is something from the Institute of Public Affairs at Temple University did a study of state legislatures and took a look at Pennsylvania. This is the most recent information that they have here, but what you can see is that the Pennsylvania mean income, at least in 2010, was less than $50,000, and you can see that rank and file state legislators do better than, by far, than the average income in the state of Pennsylvania. All right. Just clicking through, just so you see a little bit better, the range is much different depending on where you're looking at. So, in some states it may only be $24,000. I talk about these kind of citizen legislatures, but even in the most citizen legislatures, there is some sort of per diem related to your service, and you do get some sort of money that would be a little bit more significant, right? So Nebraska, at least you get $12,000 a year. That might help with some of your costs. So really, New Hampshire, we kind of look at it as being the citizen legislature that's kind of the typical citizen legislature, but it's really, almost a radical departure from what everybody else does. At least there's some money. If I'm in Georgia, I get $17,000. I can be retired and use that $17,000 at least to pay for my expenses of being a state legislator, right? In New Hampshire, it's $200 every 2 years and no expenditures, right? So you're kind of out of luck there. Just take a quick look here at a couple of demographics of state legislators around the country. Women and minorities are underrepresented, as you might imagine. So if you take a look at the country, Pennsylvania tends to be one of those states that doesn't have as many women as the lower end of amount of women that are in the state legislature. People, in the West tend to have more women, and some of the states in the South, the least amount. Interestingly enough, what you see here is the long-term trend here is that there's been an increase in the amount of women in state legislatures. But this research from the Center for American Women in Politics shows that we've kind of reached this kind of threshold at which it doesn't appear that more women are becoming state legislators, and it's somewhere in the area of about 24–25%. So about a quarter of all legislators are women around the country, but that number seems to kind of hit, as it says here, a plateau. It's not increasing. Another thing that we can take a look at when we talk about the demographic characteristics of state legislators around the country is they tend to be fairly old. So the average age of a state legislator around the country is 56, not quite that old. And one thing is that if you take a look here at the bottom, there are a couple stories done in recent years about the amount of state legislators that happen to be baby boomers or younger people. Now, certainly there are age restrictions on the amount of people, the age of the people, so you have to be 21 or 25 to be in the state legislature. But on top of that, in a state like Pennsylvania, you're going to be guaranteed to have less millennials because this is a full-time job. If I get paid $85,000 a year in amount of per diem, that's a reasonable, and I know that I'm going to have a pension as a consequence of this, that's a reasonable amount. I can stay in the state legislature for a number of years. So we have less turnover in a professional legislature, which means obviously if there's less turnover, there's less space for younger people to become involved in politics. Not to mention the fact that, it takes a while to be able to raise the money and have the profile to be able to run for state legislature as well in a state like Pennsylvania. Here's a couple other kind of demographic characteristics that might be interesting to you. Again, we saw the ratio of male to female around the country, obviously more males. Most state legislatures are overwhelmingly white. Generally, as the population of a minority rises within the state, you're more likely to have minority representation. So states with higher African American populations, particularly some in the South, have higher rates of African American state legislators. The same with Latinos and Hispanics, although not quite as much with Latinos and Hispanics. We do see, if you take a look at the upper top left-hand corner, when we take a look at the demographics of education, most members of the state legislature are more educated than the average American. The average American, if you take a look at the overall population, only about a quarter of Americans have college degrees. If you kind of cut off senior citizens, about a third of Americans have college degrees. And what you see here is that for the most part, about 3/4, or 2/3 have college degrees of some type, and a fair amount having some advanced degree. One thing is that, typically we take a look at lawmakers and we say, well, they're all a bunch of lawyers. As you can see here, only about 20% or so of state legislators are lawyers. So somewhat of a misnomer that everybody's a lawyer in the state legislature. One thing I want to point out here is that when you take a look at approval of state legislatures, and I'm going to show you some stats here in a minute about Pennsylvania, there seems to be some correlation here between professionalism and approval of state legislators, right? So if you take a look at the horizontal axis, you'll see that's the state professionalism score. So obviously, as you go start on the left-hand side, those are the least professional legislators. And if you go to the right-hand side, they are the most professional state legislatures. And then if you take a look at the vertical axis there, the legislative approval, percentage of state respondents that approve the state legislature, as it goes up, obviously that means that there's a higher amount of approval. Now, what you see, and if I had some sort of a pointer that we could look at here, which I don't, what you can see is that this area, there seems to be a trend line going here, right? And that trend line is that the more professional a legislature is, it seems as though the approval rating is a little bit less. And that line goes through here and up through here, right? So, states like California, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, all have relatively low approval. And then you've got some of these really kind of, out there states that are, less professional, have higher approval. You can't necessarily make a correlation between whether or not that means that, people are happier with professional legislatures versus non-professionalization. Part of that, if you take a look at it, is states like North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho are dominated by one political party, right? And you would be happier with those states if if everybody's a Republican in those states, they would naturally probably have a higher approval rating as opposed to approval ratings for other states. But there does seem to be that trend line that people tend to be a bit unhappier with these professionalized state legislatures. Now, I just want to show you a couple of other facts here about approval of state legislatures. So in general, Americans tend to like their state and local governments a bit more than they do the federal government. And that trend line has kind of been going up in recent years. You always see a spike in trust of the federal government. Here you can see that like in times of crisis. So you can see a spike in the trust in 2001 after 9/11. There's a spike again in trust in government at the beginning of the Iraq War, and then it continues to go down. So people have a much more favorable view of their local government, 63%, 57 state government, only 28% positive view of the federal government. Now, if you take a look at that, as you go down, it somewhat is dependent on your political party affiliation, right? So, when you talk about the federal government, Democrats are more inclined to say that, yeah, the federal government, I think they're doing a good job. Republicans, not, right? But when you take a look at state and local government, there seems to be a more bipartisan kind of belief that state and local government work better. And if you take a look here at the third chart, favorability of state governments by party control, this is some interesting kind of findings here. So not surprisingly, some of your belief in whether or not government works has to do with whether or not your party happens to be in power, right? Which is not surprising, right? So favorability rating when the state legislature and state government is all Republican tends to be higher if you're a Republican, lower if you're a Democrat, but still a majority favorable. If the state is all Democratic, the Republicans are like, no way, I can't stand you. Then Democrats are happier. And divided government seems to have somewhere in the middle there, right? So, part of our belief in whether or not government works well is if our party is in control. Just want to show you a couple of things here about Pennsylvania. These are some recent data. Our Pennsylvania legislature is completely under fire, right? So here are the most important problems in Pennsylvania as measured over recent years. And take a look at the January 2016 #1 problem, most important problem in the state of Pennsylvania is government and politicians, right? 38% of people in this poll identified government and politicians as being the largest problem. Not education, not taxes, not the economy, not even immigration, which comes in at 0%. Government and politicians, right? What kind of job do you think the state legislature is doing overall? Would you say it's doing an excellent job, a good job, only a fair job, a poor job, or don't know? Pretty bad. Only 1% say excellent job, and they're probably relatives of people or employees of people that work for the state legislature. But on the other hand, if you add up together the only a fair job or a poor job, you're looking at 80% of people saying that they're really not doing a very good job. And then finally, in Pennsylvania, we've had some budget problems over the last couple of years. The Republican state legislature has been in, jousting with Democratic Governor Wolf. And, the interesting thing is that the state legislature is generally to blame among the public for that. So you see the top chart. And these are all years in which there have been kind of bumpy stuff going on with the budget. Now, what's really interesting is this. If you take a look at most polling data, people like their representative but don't like the legislature as a whole. And that is, in some cases, been the case here in Pennsylvania, but it's shifted, right? So if you take a look at the bottom, regardless of how you feel about your own state representative, would you like to see most members of the State House of Representatives reelected in the next election or not? And, it's pretty low all throughout the history of this poll. Certainly it's down to 19% now, but 27%, 29%, give or take, that's still not very good. What I find very interesting is if you take a look at, would you like to see your state representative in Harrisburg reelected in the next election or not? And what you see is a drop here. And I think that's very significant. People are not only mad at the state legislature as a whole, at government as a whole, they're now mad at the individual person that represents them. So that's kind of a change in temperament that we've seen over the last couple of years. So that's the institutional development of state legislatures. The short of it is capacity has increased in recent years. The ability to get the job done because of more staff, and in many states because of more professionalism. And that's the basic overview that we need to know both about Pennsylvania and in general.